Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Eastside Freedom Library. The Eastside Freedom Library in real time and space sits on Dakota land on the east side of St. Paul. Tonight, you are participating with us through Facebook or YouTube or Twitter, where we exist virtually. The purpose of the Eastside Freedom Library is to inspire solidarity, work for justice, and advocate for equity for all. And we believe that promoting conversations between the past and the present is a great way to work towards these goals. This program tonight is co-sponsored by the Ramsey County Historical Society under the rubric of their History Revealed program. We have been partners in presenting this series for 2 years now. And although we can't present programs in person, we're pleased to be able to present tonight's program and more upcoming History Revealed programs in partnership between the Eastside Freedom Library, Ramsey County Historical Society. Let me mention that on the evening of August 12th, in this kind of a format, we will be interacting with Martha Jones and her new book, Vanguard, How Black Women Broke Barriers, Won the Right to Vote, and Inspired Equality for All. That will be on August 12th. We want to encourage viewers to support both the Freedom Library and Ramsey County Historical Society. There will be links that if you want, that you can take advantage of. And you can certainly find out more about both organizations on our websites and learn how you too can become involved. Let me introduce briefly our 3 distinguished speakers. Marty Case is the author of The Relentless Business of Treaties, How Indigenous Land Became U.S. Property. We want to make clear that Marty would have liked to have had an indigenous scholar or voice involved in this with us. I do want to mention that at some point down the road, Chris Matununpa, who is a Dakota elder and has a book coming out hopefully in August called The Great Evil, Christianity, the Bible, and the Native American Genocide, that we will have a program with Chris. But we appreciate Marty's work, his work with Minnesota Humanities Center, with the Allies Media and Art Project, as a researcher and writer, and as a primary creator of the Why Treaties Matter exhibit, which has been here at the Eastside Freedom Library and generated a great deal of productive conversation. Our second speaker this evening will be Christopher Layman. Chris is a professor of ethnic studies at St. Cloud State University. He is the author of Slavery's Reach, Southern Slaveholders in the North Star State, which is what brings him into the screen this evening. But he's also the author of Slavery in the Upper Mississippi Valley, and Power, Politics, and the Decline of the Civil Rights Movement, and the colored cartoon, Black Representation in American Animated Short Films, and a critical history of Soul Train on TV. So specific historical periods are boundaries to be leapt by Professor Layman, and we're delighted to have him with us this evening. And our third speaker is Bill Green, professor of history at Augsburg University in Minneapolis. Bill is here because of his latest book, The Children of Lincoln, White Paternalism and the Limits of Black Opportunity in Minnesota. I had to check the dates. It says 1860 to 1876. I thought maybe it was 2010 to 2020. White Paternalism and the Limits of Black Opportunity in Minnesota. Bill is also the author of Degrees of Freedom, The Origin of Civil Rights in Minnesota, 1865 to 1912, A Peculiar Imbalance, The Fall and Rise of Racial Equality in Minnesota, 1837 to 1869. And it would appear that he is about to publish another book, Nellie Francis, Fighting for Racial Justice and Women's Equality in Minnesota, which has been advertised as coming out in January of 2021. So these are, as we like to say at the Eastside Freedom Library, some serious knowledge producers, and we're very happy to let them drop some knowledge on us this evening, and hopefully inspire and motivate us to go and create more knowledge ourselves. So I'm going to play moderator and throw questions out, and I want to start by asking each of our panelists, why did you write this book that you wrote? And we'll start with Marty Case.
Thanks, Peter. I, years ago, ran across the name of Joel Poinsett, who was a commissioner for the Dakota U.S. Treaty of 1837, and found that he was, in fact, the guy that named the poinsettia after himself. And I thought, well, there's some interesting stories just in the signatures on these historic documents. So I started looking at who had signed them, and first noticed the level of connectivity among the US treaty signers. Surprising connections on a family level, business level, political level. There were so many connections that they could be read as networks. And then I realized what I had was a lens on the system that was spreading across the continent. Eventually, I started thinking about some of the implications of that system. And it's mostly for the relationship between people in the natural world that a property system was generating. So I wrote the book basically to document and inventory those connections and see if readers would come up with the same implications, I guess.
Why did you write Slavery's Reach?
Well, I wrote Slavery's Reach because when I moved here to Minnesota 18 years ago, I was very interested in local history, and I wanted to learn about when African Americans first came to St. Cloud, which is where I live. And learning about that grew into trying to find out names of African Americans in Minnesota in the 1850s and 1860s who were born in the South, and then seeing if I can trace their lives in the South before coming to Minnesota. And I think it was about 6 years ago when I saw the name of a white Southerner from Maryland who was also listed as a resident of St. Paul, Minnesota at the same time. His name was Harwood Iglehart of Iglehart Avenue in St. Paul, and he was listed in the 1860 census as a Minnesota resident, but he was also listed in the 1860 slave schedule as an enslaver of a woman in Maryland. And that got me to thinking, well, how many more people are there like Iglehart who spent some time in Minnesota but still held on to their slaves in the South? And then I looked at what Iglehart did, which was sell land and be a real estate agent. And that led me to looking at real estate deeds. And around the same time, I was reading books like Edward Baptist's The Half Has Never Been Told, and other books that look at capitalism's role in slavery in the United States. And I realized that real estate deeds were this documented proof that money changed hands from Southern slaveholders to Minnesotans. And Minnesotans used that money to develop businesses and institutions and communities. And in the cases of Belle Plaine and Shakopee, entire towns. And Slavery's Reach is basically my 5-year collection of all those deeds and other documents. in my attempt to make sense out of all of them.
Thank you. Bill, why did you write Children of Lincoln?
I was first motivated to tell a story that I hadn't seen written before regarding what was going on in the North during Reconstruction. In many of the books that cover the late 19th century, and in particular looking at Reconstruction, the impression that's left to readers and scholars, I think, alike, is that Reconstruction, for all intents and purposes, was a Southern phenomenon of occupation of Northern troops in the South, the spread of white supremacy, the spread of Black terrorism, Black terror, and the erosion of hard-fought battles to establish civil rights for African Americans. But it seemed to be a story, a chapter in American history that was principally about the South. And oftentimes what was ignored was not only any kind of reference or substantive reference of the North, but of Minnesota in particular, which got me into looking at what was it like in Minnesota during that same time period. And a lot was going on, obviously, because of this huge influx of immigration. This is also a time of agitation for women's suffrage. African Americans were beginning to move westward, but some were moving northward as well. Industrialization, labor relations, these were all huge, huge forces that were happening in the North during the time of Reconstruction that seemed to fall outside the very concept of Reconstruction as it was conventionally known. So I wanted to take a look at that, what was going on in the North during this period, and in particular, my adopted state, Minnesota. I wanted to see what was happening in Minnesota. There's always a sense that the state is and has been exceptional in its relations with people of color, African Americans in particular, not so much with Native Americans. And I wanted to sort of examine that as well, even though the state back then had an exceptionally small number of African Americans living here. So there are a lot of questions that rose that sparked my interest in this time period.
Thank you. So, Marty, if there were to be one takeaway that you wanted readers to come away from your book with, what would that takeaway be?
I think it would be that the spread of the U.S. property system across the continent was more than who owns the land. The treaties are often sold as land transactions, but I think it was something more profound than that. It was a struggle between how human beings relate to the natural world. And the system that was spreading was a property system, replacing or attempting to replace that indigenous kinship relationship that exists in indigenous communities around the world. And one of the big implications of that is that white supremacist thinking was part and parcel of that system that was spreading. Mm-hmm. And I was surprised, and I tried to convey a bit how conscious and planned the spread of that property system and its white supremacist point of view were during the 1800s. And then also the extent to which the people who were involved in that spread also created the mythology around it, mm-hmm. by creating the historical societies and all these institutions. So it's about the spread of the property system as a way people relate to the natural world.
Great, thank you. Uh-huh. And Chris, if you were to try to identify one big takeaway that you would like readers of Slavery's Reach to come away with, What might that be?
I'd like for readers to have the takeaway that the slavery economy of the United States most definitely reached Minnesota, and that Minnesotans were active participants in the slave economy. Some were unwitting, but others were deliberate, meaning that they deliberately sought Southern slaveholders to do business with them. And Henry Rice and Sylvanus Lowry are two good examples of that. And I think the depth of slavery's reach, so to speak, in Minnesota's economy can be best exemplified with Jane Graceless Helm, who's arguably Minnesota's best known abolitionist. Now, the story goes that people who know about her are most familiar with is that she was able to trick Sylvanus Lowry into funding her abolitionist newspaper, The Visitor, in St. Cloud. But in looking at what made Lowry so rich in 1857 was that he had sold land that he had purchased in northern St. Cloud to some acquaintances of his father, who was from the slave state of Tennessee at the time. So in the summer of 1856, these half dozen slaveholders from Tennessee came to St. Cloud and bought $12,000 worth of real estate from Lowry, which would be $250,000 today. And Lowry used that money to build warehouses for locals to rent, to have their businesses, and he started a Pony Express of his own. And he had already been wealthy from being involved in the fur trade. He was employed by American Fur, which was owned by 3 slaveholders from St. Louis. So there was money from slavery just totally tied up in Lowry's wallet. So when Swiss Helm is borrowing money from Lowry, she's using that money that slaveholders gave to Lowry to start her anti-slavery newspaper. So for an abolitionist to rely on money from slaveholders indirectly to start her paper just shows you just how inescapable slave capital was for Minnesota at the time.
Thank you. And I think that the examples that you've given also suggest how interwoven relationships between white settlers and indigenous peoples. So whose land was that in northern St. Cloud before Mr. Lowry came along to plunk down that money? And where did the fur trade come from that Mr. Lowry made his money in? So these interwoven relationships that are racially grounded and show us the birth of a racial capitalism here in the Midwest. Bill, the same question for you. If there was one takeaway that you would like readers to come away from Children of Lincoln with, what might that be?
Well, the biggest one for me is the notion that springs from the fact that Minnesotans did have something to celebrate with regard to, doing the right thing in terms of fighting for freedom and fighting for the enfranchisement of Black men, and also pushing for legislation that would make school segregation against the law, where the state would take away state funding from school districts that continue to segregate on the basis of race. And then in 1883, after the 1885, after the Supreme Court had ruled against a federal law that would ban segregation or discrimination in public settings, Minnesota passed the Public Accommodations Act and made 2 different amendments in addition to that, one of which sponsored by an African-American legislator from Minneapolis, Frank Wheaton. Now, with all of that said, and I might also add one more thing, 1902 was the year when the most prominent leaders of Black America, Black intellectual and political thought, came to St. Paul to discuss the modern agenda for civil rights. And we're talking about people like Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois and Ida B. Wells and T. Thomas Fortune and many others came to St. Paul, and they held those sessions in the state legislature. And the governor of the state, Gus Van Sant, gave the keynote address of welcome. So all of that makes Minnesota look exceptional during a time in history when Blacks were being lynched all over the nation. Okay, cool. During that time as well, discrimination continued. Blacks were being denied admission into speaking halls, even where Black leaders were speaking. Blacks were not allowed to come in. They were not allowed to go to certain restaurants, even though law forbade it. So you have the law and the policy that talked about equal opportunity, while at the same time the practice of the average man on the street could be discriminatory, and he could discriminate without any kind of reprisal from government. So you have this parallel universe existing. For me, the key thing is this. When you basically achieve a lot of good things and then rest on your laurels, that's the surest way of seeing those victories disappear, dissolve. And I think that that's kind of the message of the children of Lincoln for all intents and purposes. Mm. These are people who did good things, did heroic things, and then stopped doing any kind of thing in consideration of the humanity of African Americans. It basically put all of the responsibility of dealing with racism and the denial of opportunity for employment, housing, education, whatever, left that completely to the African American deal with. They said basically, we have done our part. So for me, the central theme here is all the good things that a society does for a minority community can just disappear when that majority society rests on those laurels, takes the foot off the accelerator, allows for momentum to slow down and end. That you have to be vigilant, you have to constantly struggle, even though you've won some major battles. You can't stop doing it. So that's one of the key things. I also want to take one more, give one more thing that I think is important here, Peter, if it's okay, and with my colleagues.
Sure.
And that is the nature of the power dynamic between Blacks and whites during this particular time. All of the liberals that I looked at during this time none of them had any kind of personal relationship with African Americans. They dealt with African Americans as if they were an abstraction. And so when Blacks and whites talked to each other, it was usually a situation where it was the white person doing the talking and the Black person being quiet. So the power dynamic was imbalanced. I think that's one reason why the Friends of African Americans felt that they were doing the right thing, because Black people did not feel like they could challenge that for fear that they would lose whatever patronage they had. So I think it's, the other thing I want to leave with this is that, the balance of power is so key in race relations, and it's oftentimes overlooked. Can Blacks and whites really talk with a mind towards giving up privilege in order to share equity with the other side? That's one of the things I want to share.
Thank you. So let me just jump in and say to people who are watching that we want to encourage you to type in through the comment function on the Facebook and YouTube pages, comments and questions. And these authors will be available to respond after the presentation is over. So we want to try in this environment to make it as interactive a process as we can. I want to ask just one more question and then really talk about how your work is relevant to, connected to, provides us with some grounding to understand this moment that we're in now. But I want to ask, as a historian myself, I think that one of the great experiences of my research was to come across something that surprised me, something that I wasn't necessarily looking for, and that forced me to do some additional thinking about the story that I was going to tell. So I want to ask each of the three of you if you can share with us something in your research that surprised you. Marty?
You know, I started having kind of that received story about the history of the continent, and was continually surprised through years of research, and wound up, gathering some information, but knowing a lot of people who still know more about treaties than I do. So I was basically left to construct the entire book out of things that surprised me. It was the only touchstone I had, This surprised me, this surprised me. One of the biggest things, though, a realization, was that this settler colonialist enterprise of appropriating indigenous land and African labor, the labor of people of African descent, was well underway before the modern formation of race.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, that European color coding of the human race and the assigning of the supremacist hierarchy was created specifically to justify the settler colonialist enterprise here in our continent.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, it's a lot of people, I think, take that as their starting point. To me, it was a realization. And maybe we'll get into this a little bit more, but it just underscores to me how fundamental white supremacism is in shaping the entire history of the continent after European arrival, and shaping all the institutions we have. It's really, it underscores that point.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yeah.
Chris, what surprised you?
Well, definitely what surprised me was finding out about the loan that William Aiken gave to the University of Minnesota, because I wasn't looking for that. I had found that on accident. I had found in the real estate deeds in Stearns County that Aiken's colleague in Congress, James Orr, who just had his portrait removed by Nancy Pelosi, had bought land in Stearns County. So whenever I found out about people who purchased land in Minnesota, I would see if I could find any digitized old newspapers about their trips to Minnesota to buy the land. So it was in looking at an old newspaper about Orr coming to Minnesota that I found that Orr had come with Aiken. And the newspaper article talked about Aiken buying some land in Minnesota too, and loaning money to the U of M. And after I saw this in the newspaper, I looked at the University of Minnesota archives, and they confirmed that. And Aiken loaned $15,000, which again is $250,000 today, in 1856. And then in 1857, he cashed out half the loan, leaving $8,000 at the U of M. And then the Civil War broke out. But even though Aiken lived in a Confederate state, Minnesota owed that money to Aiken still, but didn't want to give it back to him since now he was a Confederate. And I was really surprised at the lengths to which the state of Minnesota went to keep that money. The Minnesota legislature passed a law a year after the Civil War broke out to say that if a Confederate resident wanted to go to Minnesota and sue in Minnesota's courts, he or she can't. So that was the Rebellion Act of 1862. And with that act, Aiken had no recourse to try to get his money back. So the state of Minnesota allowed the U of M to keep the loan and essentially claim it as their own money. So Aiken never did get his money back. But that was the most surprising thing that I found, was that Minnesota really went out of its way to keep this money from a very wealthy slaveholder. He had 700 slaves in South Carolina, while at the same time having a Republican governor and being this anti-slavery state.
Thank you. So, Bill, this is the third book that you've written about the 19th century in Minnesota. Was there still something that surprised you in digging into this material?
Yeah, many things surprised me, but one of the things was the differentiated notion of racism that white liberals of the mid-19th century had between African Americans, had towards African Americans and Native Americans. There's a moment in Children of Lincoln where Robert Hickman, a fugitive slave, finds sanctuary, so to speak, or at least makes it up the Mississippi River in 1863. He cannot land in St. Paul because the Irish laborers think that he's there to break a strike. So they're throwing rocks and sticks and beating up these African Americans who they view as scabs, until finally the boat pulls back out into the Mississippi River and heads up to Fort Snelling. It was surprising to me to imagine, to sense what Hickman must have felt being in the promised land after that experience. And then the barge that he's on is brought to dock, so to speak, at Pike Island, where the Dakota prisoners were sequestered. And the encampment of the Dakota was nightmarish. I mean, people had buried their dead under their teepees. Malaria, and at this time of year when Hickman arrives, the flooding of the region has just begun to subside. So it's very muddy and marshy as they get off this boat. What Hickman must have thought, and his fellow pilgrims, fellow fugitives, what they must have felt looking at peoples who they had never seen before, who they had never seen, and trying to make sense of this. Climbing that embankment up to Fort Snelling, surrounded by an armed guard. They wouldn't know this at the time, but that many of those soldiers were from St. Paul, who were, resistant, who did not like to see blacks coming in. So I was surprised at this hurricane, this whirlwind of tension, of passion, of racism existing. The Irish immigrants themselves, or the Irish settlers themselves and laborers themselves, were despised by the Yankees. All of that is conspiring at the same time. I just never really thought of Minnesota up until that point as having that many dynamics to it, that layers to it, all in one particular moment.
Wow. Well, I think that what the three of you have shared is really a great lead-in to all of our efforts to make sense out of this moment that we're living in now, 3 months into the COVID pandemic, which has struck different communities in very different ways, consequences, has also made many of us more attentive to what's on the news and what we're seeing, and there's a sort of different kind of awareness going on. and then a month ago, the murder of George Floyd, and the emergence of, I'm sure historians of the future will argue about the right noun to use: uprising, riot, rebellion, movement, all of the above, in a neighborhood that the American Indian movement had had a significant impact in, with their patrols and their struggles with the Minneapolis Police Department. It's a remarkable time that we're living in. And as a historian, I want to believe that somehow the study of history is useful in our sorting through what's going on. So let me ask the three of you, what do you think your work says to this moment that we're living in now? And I think what I'll do is I'll let you volunteer rather than pick on you. Let you volunteer. Who wants to bat first?
Well, I'll jump in.
All right.
Two things. When people ask me whether I agree with them that we're seeing major change occur, they're always disappointed when I say it remains to be seen, because their sense of history is today. It's not in the 1960s. It's not any concept of what happened in the 19th century. It's today. I think you can point to various things that appear to be unique to today's experience. But, you know, people have a hard time staying inside for how many months, you know, for a few months in order to fight this pandemic. We have, and we seem to be apologizing for the lack of patience that this country is not able to show. And I think that conspires with the inability of people to understand and sustain the long-term effort that you have to do if you're really going to make significant change.
Mm-hmm.
So it for me remains to be seen. And that's what my research tells me for the most part. Mm-hmm. That it's one thing to solve an immediate problem and then think that it's all done. Mm-hmm. It's easy to solve a problem dealing with race for the moment and think that all the other problems that are part of systemic oppression will somehow be resolved. And it's easy for people to feel that they can provide an equitable system without giving up privilege, a certain degree of privilege. That's what my research, I think, mm-hmm. taught me, at least, and what I think we're grappling with today. So.
Thank you. Thank you. Who wants to go next?
Did you want to go, Chris?
Go ahead.
Chris.
I'm struck in what I learned in not only how related these large and potentially overwhelming issues are, and the centrality of racism to them. You know, we're not only dealing with this moment in the racial, but we have the pandemic, and we have the climate change issue. And I think maybe it's particularly true for white people, but it just seems like so many big things going on. Mm-hmm. And in fact, they're so related and always have been. I was struck in Children of God about the impact of disease on the racial integration of the Army and the relationships between white and Black veterans and how they were shaped by these epidemics during the Civil War. and that has a real impact on US history. And the fact that the spread of the property system was basically part of this biblical imperative to subjugate the earth, and that racism developed to further that end. I mean, it indicates to me that you can't adequately address climate change and climate crisis without addressing racism. You can't get around racism to do that. You have to go through it and dismantle these racist systems. And then the cautionary tale about just how deeply rooted race is in the shape of America. Every property title based on the racist doctrine of discovery. I hear sometimes liberal churches talking about, you know, we need to repudiate the doctrine of discovery, which is the foundation of property titles. I don't know what that means, because it's the repudiation of private property. I don't know what if people realize what they're saying. It seems to miss how fundamentally the US is shaped by racism, which to me makes it the moral imperative and practical imperative that we're facing right now.
Thank you. Thank you. Chris?
Well, I see two things that I think make my book relevant to what's going on today. The first has to do with social media, which I pay attention to probably more than I should. But after George Floyd's killing last month, I started reading people's objections to other people saying that what happened to Floyd was just the latest example of the police evolving from slave patrols during the days of slavery. And so the people who were challenging that were saying, why are people talking about slave patrols in Minnesota? Minnesota never had slaves. So if you're trying to talk about current events and you have a basic misunderstanding of history, then your understanding of current events is just flawed from the get-go. And what I'm hoping that people understand from reading my book is that because Minnesota existed as a territory and then a state during the last 16 years of legal slavery nationwide, and because the slave economy was so powerful in the United States, that you can't live in a country with an institution that powerful and not be affected. And for whatever reason, this stereotype of Minnesota as pure and untouched by slavery has just stuck for the last century and a half. But it's just completely wrong. And then the second thing is that I have seen a pattern with regard to this big rush to open up businesses, no matter how much it hurts the essential workers, and this desperation to hold on to slavery in Minnesota, no matter how much it hurts the slaves. So what happened was, in 1857, the Dred Scott decision made slavery legal in Minnesota for 14 months. And so during that spring and summer of 1857, there was this big influx of Southern slaveholders to Minnesota, because they knew that while they were on vacation in Minnesota with their slaves, nobody was going to try to free them because Dred Scott was the law. But then when Minnesota becomes a free state the following year, Minnesotans decide that they're still going to let slaveholders bring their slaves with them and just not say anything about it and not do anything, because they really need those Southern tourism dollars. I mean, that's why Minnesota tried to, or some Minnesotans tried to make Minnesota a slave state 2 years after it was a free state. Bill's book, A Peculiar Imbalance, introduced me to that. And then you have the Rebellion Act 2 years later, to William Aiken's money. And while this is happening every spring and summer, the 1 or 2 slaves that are going with their slaveholders on these trips are having to leave their family members and their slave communities behind and be in Minnesota for weeks or months at a time by themselves with hardly any free community of African Americans around them. And then they have to go back once the fall comes and the vacation's over for the slaveholders, and then try to get reacquainted and readjusted to being back on the plantation. So this disregard for the people who are suffering the most, those are the things that I see in my book and the things that I see with the rush to open businesses too soon.
Thank you. So we have a few minutes left. Let me invite each of you, if you have a question that you would like to pose to one of the others, here's your chance.
I have a question for Bill and Marty. I have come across a couple of occasions in which our 3 books have been lumped together as this sort of new wave of interpreting history, this deliberate attempt to establish new historical narratives. And I wanted to know what both of you thought was the hardest part of reimagining a local history or try to create a new narrative.
Well, it's a lonely thing. It's not as lonely now as it was before, but it can be a lonely thing because this is true for all 3 of us. We're looking at people who pretty much, as far as the canon was concerned, resided at best in footnotes. And the books that had been made up the canon of Minnesota history, the lithography was much larger than the typeset in the footnotes. So it was very easy to just sort of gloss over the experience and the reality and the presence of whole cultures, that didn't neatly fit into, the narrative of the Northern European experience in Minnesota. So learning how to read between the lines, learning how to stand a certain way, learning how to hold the book in a certain kind of position, and getting the lighting just right so that you can kind of see what's not apparent, was always challenging. And always, when finding what seems like the logic of a significant other, you have to apply yourself, your own sense of humanity to often kind of validate that you're heading in the right direction, and you're asking the right questions. Now, things are better now because, I've got you guys. And, that's what makes, I think, the new scholarship, if we call it that, so much more exciting. The work of Walt Bachman, for example, in his, I know you know this book, the Slavery at Fort Snelling, and Joseph Godfrey, and Leah Vandervelde, who did 2 incredible books on slavery in the West, and Fort Snelling and Mrs. Dred Scott. All of that stuff has a way of kind of building each other and making us all much better as historians, giving us a sense of a community. And I think in terms, creating a new sense of awareness for the larger community. Anyway.
Thank you. Marty?
I think one of the challenges is that if you're going to try to reimagine that narrative, the narrative is so big and so detailed. And in looking at slavery's reach, I ran across that chapter bankers and insurance agents. And I thought, oh my God, I wonder if this author like me hit this and said, oh God, I got to write a chapter about bankers and insurance agents. The consequences are so huge, but the activity is so tedious, you know. But you can't ignore it, you know, depending on what you're trying to do in your book. And so I noticed that in both of our works, we have various networks we're trying to untangle or depict, and various professions and various associations, because to get to that new story, even if it's only a glimpse of a new story, you have to undo so much connective tissue to get to the heart and attack that, if that makes sense, you know. And then one thing I don't think I ever got to in my book was, because I think of mine as kind of an inventory of connections. And it's great to see, for instance, in that Hickman story in Children of Lincoln, and so many other stories in that book, and some of the details you presented, Chris, just the telling of a new story. It's just exciting to have a story told that's in a new context than that kind of master narrative that's shaped public history for so long with all of its assumptions. Just great to encounter stories written from a different set of assumptions or a different insight. I just admired that so much in both of your books. Endeavor. You know?
Well, you know, none of you have mentioned what it's like to be living in this moment where monuments are being pulled down, where, you know, we had discussions here at the Eastside Freedom Library probably beginning 4 years ago about, is it time to change the name of the you know, do we need to reconsider all of these foundational stories taken for granted? I like to think as a historian who cares more about the future than I do about the past, that I hope that what's happening is creating the space for the stories that we have all been digging into and telling, that more people are interested now in hearing those stories. And I think it's still scary to think about, is there another grand narrative? You know, what if we replace all the monuments with new monuments, and then we discover that the new monuments are to people who were sexual harassers, who were money grubbers, who any number of, you know, do we say, well, it's just all complicated, life is complicated, and we throw up our hands? It's a great moment, I think, to try to figure out if we can create a new story that makes sense, that people can carry forward and help us build a future that really has justice and fairness and humanity in it.
I don't think there's anything wrong in having monuments as long as we don't elevate them to, you know, a talismanic type of position. You know, I mean, we should be reevaluating. That should be part of the human experience. You know, assessing where we are, what we've learned, what needs to change. You know, you know, we're all familiar, and I heard this for the first time a couple of days ago. The whole debate around the emancipation monument.
Yeah.
And that's an image that I use in the Children of Lincoln because I think it perfectly characterizes the paternalism that existed among, you know, the friends of Black people in the 19th century. But But it also tells a deeper story, because I'm not sure that Lincoln himself would have liked that kind of notoriety. You know, I mean, this is something, and that the monument was initiated by a black woman, a former slave. She's the one who put the money down, and colored troops paid for it. But none of them had any say in what that statue should look like, which is why, I mean, that's the story of race in America today.
Right. Yep.
And that kind of analysis, I think, keeps us honest. That's not necessarily an argument to say that it should come down and that it should stay up, but the purpose of monuments, it seems to me, is that it, among other things, gives us some sort of landmark, some sort of guidepost of where we've been, but also it can spark a whole new examination of where we are now and what we aspire to be in the future.
Yeah.
My thoughts on this are kind of informed by my wife Mona was one of the artists involved in reinterpreting Bademakaska in its name restoration from Lake Calhoun. And of course, there were people that were just freaking that we'd be losing history by changing a name, the name of Calhoun. And among the media she created was an interview with a Dakota person who said, yeah, I can understand how that name change would be challenging for you. Imagine everything in the world getting a new name. You know, that's what the expansion of the US into Minnesota did. In a matter of years, everything was called something else. And I think some of this discussion about monuments is an indication of how elastic we can be in accommodating versions of the past, and how complex and sophisticated we can make our relationship to the past. And I don't think that has to be tied to a statute. I think it's good to discuss probably whether a statute is coming down or not, but those statues are not necessarily history, they're an interpretation of the history, and that's kind of what makes them interesting, and also what makes them targets.
Yeah. I don't know if you have seen the images of projections of faces, like George Floyd's face, on the Robert E. Lee Monument in Richmond.
Yeah.
And it's one of the most visually remarkable things that I've seen, to see these changing faces projected onto the Lee Monument. It makes me want the problem never to be resolved. You know, let's keep stirring this up. Let's keep looking at what does it mean to connect these faces to each other. And I'm sure that one of the reasons that some of the people on the other side want to take that monument down is that it's now covered with all of this political graffiti, and there isn't a clean inch of it that hasn't been commented on by people in 2020. And boy, that's unnerving for people, that nothing then is sacrosanct in looking at this either. Well, Bill, are you about to say something?
Yeah, about that. I think that, you know, the other side of that same point is that we, you know, we're this whole period of re-examining statutes and whatnot. I mean, it shows that we're better than we thought we were, that we can look at artifacts and make changes and the world won't fall apart. It is a source of empowerment to think critically about the sacred cow. And, you know, for that reason, I'm kind of hopeful, because much of my life has been has experienced times where old things from the past were kept in place. I was working on a project, the Capitol, and selecting the art to be placed in the building. I'm not sure where it stands now because I'm no longer involved in that, but it was interesting to see or to hear the discussion about the removing of the Dakota battle scenes. As Gwen Westerman, historian, great historian or cultural historian in Mankato, commented that the faces of the Minnesota regiments were clearly identifiable because the artists went through the effort to capture those likenesses accurately so that people could see themselves and their uncles and their grandfathers and their great-grandfathers for posterity. But the faces of the Dakota were without impression whatsoever. It was as if that was not the legacy that mattered. In attacking or at least addressing those paintings, we were oftentimes accused of changing history. And so I was reminded of that in the point that you made earlier. What is history? Who does it belong to? And to me, the answer is obvious, as I think it is with all of them. But what do we want history to do once we make that decision as to who it belongs to? What do we want it to do? Perpetuate old systems or to inspire us to create new? And it's a scary thing either way.
Either way, yep. Well, let me wrap this up and thank Marty Case, Chris Layman, Bill Green. Let me recommend to viewers that if you have not read these books, please do. You can buy these books from the independent bookstores whose websites will appear after this conversation is over. We want to encourage viewers to send in comments and questions in the next 20-minute period or so. Let us hear from you. I want to thank the three of you for your work and your presence this evening. And I know the future work that yet you're going to be producing. So thank you all. Stay safe and well. And let's keep trying to build a better world for us and those who will come after. Thank you.
Thank you.
All of you.
Thank you.
Thank you for visiting our video. I'm Beth Cleary.
I'm Peter Ratcliffe, and this is Orso, the library dog.
We are the co-founders and co-executive directors of the East Side Freedom Library in St. Paul, Minnesota.
Our mission is to inspire solidarity, work for justice, and advocate for equity for all. If you enjoy our programming and want to support our work, please visit our website, eastsidefreedomlibrary.org.